Welcome, everyone. This is the second ESS lecture for the spring 2021 semester. I am delighted to introduce Jim Sidanius, professor at Harvard University in psychology. I've known Jim for quite a while. He was a professor at UCLA when I was a graduate student, and I think the first few times we met was at a lecture series called Behavior, Evolution, and Culture, which is the kind of the idea from which I got to form ESS. For those of you who are logging in for the first time and are not on our email list, if you'd like to be added, please send me a line and I will add you to our email list. We have a few more lectures this semester. We are planning next year's activities, but given the current state of the pandemic and the uncertainty, I'm not yet sure whether we're planning on in-person or online. So stay tuned for that. With that, I will let Jim take over. He's going to talk about social dominance theory and in particular, how it relates to gender prejudice. So actually, if you could unmute yourself, we can all clap to welcome Jim.
Thank you. Thank you. I regard myself as a refugee of the American civil rights and Black Power movements from the 1960s and early 70s. And while there's been tremendous progress made in the degree of freedom and freedom of choice and freedom from discrimination, I have to come to the conclusion, all things being considered, that the American civil rights movement was a failure. It was a failure to achieve what I wanted to do. What the reason why I joined the movement was to eliminate all vestiges of discrimination, racism, and oppression in the United States. But I had to come to the conclusion that these goals were really not being satisfied. And I asked myself the question, why was it not happening? Why was oppression and racial discrimination so sticky? What was going on? Could I think about the problem of oppression in a different way than I had before? So in order to try to come to terms with this problem, I developed a model called social dominance theory, which was meant to be a generalized theory of oppression and not one specifically tailored to the United States. And the basic observation of social dominance theory was that human social systems appear to be structured as group-based social hierarchies. There are vast differences in the degree and severity of the hierarchy across different societies and across time. But the fact of hierarchy itself seems to be a human universal. And the two most basic assumptions of social dominance theory is one, since social hierarchies are so ubiquitous, I made the assumption that human social groups are probably predisposed to function in a group-based hierarchical manner. So that's one assumption. The second assumption is that the common forms of social oppression, that is to say, racism, slavery, sexism, nationalism, classism, sectarianism, speciesism, are really special instantiations of the tendency to create, maintain, and recreate some form of group-based social hierarchy, or to develop hierarchies in general. The primary goal of social dominance theory was to try to understand and identify the multi-leveled mechanisms responsible for the creation, maintenance, and recreation of group-based social hierarchy. In thinking about group-based social hierarchy, we came up with three primary types of group-based social hierarchy. The first one was based on age, where adults have more power and control over children. That seems to be a very obvious distinction between social groups. The second universal form of social hierarchy is patriarchy, in which males seem to have more power and social control of the society than women do, or females do. And the patriarchal social system seems to be a universal. It varies in severity from one society to another. So, for instance, the more extreme forms of patriarchy can be found in societies like Saudi Arabia, parts of India, and Afghanistan, whereas milder forms of patriarchy are to be found in countries like Scandinavia and Northern Europe in general. And while they're matriarchal societies, matrilineal societies, there are no societies which we know to be matriarchal. And matrilineal societies, of course, are those societies in which one's social identity is inherited through the female line. And examples of this would be Judaism, where one's identity as a Jew is defined by whether or not one's mother is Jewish. But that's matrilineal societies are still not matriarchal societies. There are some exceptions to this tendency among social animals, primates in particular, to form patriarchal social structures. One of them are bonobos, in which the degree to which social power is owned by one sex, this society tends to be matriarchal rather than patriarchal. It is the case that the species of bonobo are dimorphic, and so there are differences in body shape and size and strength, but the political system in this species is matriarchal. A second exception to the general rule of patriarchy is to be found among the Moriki monkeys of the New World, which are generally gender egalitarian, where there is no major difference in size or strength between males and females, and in which the degree to which there's a social structure within this species, it tends to be gender egalitarian. The third exception is to be found among lemurs. And then this is a species in which is a matriarchy, to the degree to which there is a political system that can be identified, it tends to be matriarchal. Fourthly, a fourth exception to this general rule of patriarchy is to be found with the spotted hyena. And this is a rather dramatic exception, because as opposed to most other social species or apes or monkeys, it's the female hyena which is the bigger, stronger, more ferocious sex and has more power over males and constitute a genuinely matriarchal society. The third type of social hierarchy is, for me, the more interesting one, which is what we call an arbitrary-set hierarchy. And an arbitrary-set hierarchy is a hierarchy in which social groups are socially constructed, and they can be socially constructed on any particular basis. So race, tribe, class, religious sect, caste, lineage, minimal groups, etc., can be regarded as arbitrary set hierarchies. So I'm going to make 4 arguments in this presentation. The first one is that arbitrary set hierarchies really need to be understood as gendered phenomena, in that, on average, males will display higher levels of arbitrary set aggression, xenophobia, discrimination, social predation, and social dominance orientation than will females, everything else being equal. And this general principle applies across a hominid clade or cluster. So is to be found among gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and humans. The next argument is, in general, not only are outgroup males have higher levels of discrimination, discriminatory behavior, xenophobia, and social predation, but males are also the primary targets of social oppression rather than females. And this notion of males being the target of social predation and social aggression is called the subordinate male target hypothesis, sometimes also known as the outgroup male target hypothesis. Fourthly, we argue that the motives for arbitrary set discrimination are somewhat different between males and females. Arbitrary set discrimination among males is primarily motivated by some combination of aggression and social dominance orientation, whereas the arbitrary set discrimination driven by females is proximately driven by some combination of fear, especially fear of sexual coercion at the hands of outgroup males. Okay, what's the theory behind this notion that arbitrary set discrimination should interact with gender? And this is based upon, has been heavily influenced by the work of Darwin in his sexual selection theory and Robert Trivers in his parental investment theory. And basically, we assume that males and females are confronted with slightly different reproductive constraints, opportunities, and challenges. So, for instance, while the obligatory reproductive investment of males generally ends with fertilization, the act of reproduction is substantially more costly for females. And these include the costs of gestation, birthing, lactation, and the non-negligible risk of death in childbirth. Because males and females inhabit slightly different reproductive spaces, we argue that they will have different strategies, reproductive strategies, which will have politically consequential effects. So we can conceive of two reproductive strategies, which are typically male or typically female, where the emphasis in reproductive activity is directed towards. Among females, a lot more effort is put into the raising or the rearing of their offspring. Whereas for males, the reproductive emphasis is on achieving mating opportunities. Now, if this difference is vaguely correct between emphasis placed on rearing up efforts and mating efforts, we should expect certain behavioral consequences among males and females. Among females, a set of behavioral consequences will be relatively high investment in offspring, relatively high mate choosiness, and preference for high status and high provisioning males. Among males, in contrast, males will have reproductive success to the degree to which they can attract females for reproductive activities. And in order to do this, having high social status, exercising a great deal of political power and resource control often lead to high male-on-male competition. And these two mating strategies of male and female have political implications. One of them being the existence of patriarchy itself, where males exert a certain amount of coercive dominance over females on average, and arbitrary-set hierarchy, which are dominance hierarchies among males as a function of intra-sex competition, and often leading to male-on-male extractive coalitions. Now, if this reasoning is approximately correct, it has a couple of interesting consequences, and it's these consequences we're going to look at. One of them is the hypothesis we call in this theory, the invariance hypothesis, which basically states that xenophobia, social predation, and social dominance orientation, SDO, will be greater among males than among females, everything else being equal. Again, there are differences in the severity of SDO across different cultures and across time, but the difference in SDO between males and females will be constant across cultures and across time. To get an idea of what we mean by social dominance orientation, we've developed a measurement, a scale measuring this phenomena we call the SDO scale, and it consists of items like, to get ahead in life, it's sometimes necessary to step on other groups. Inferior groups should stay in their place. Superior groups should dominate inferior groups. And the obverse of those, all groups should be given an equal chance in life. And we have 16 items which constitute what we call the SDO 7 scale. And this notion that there will be constant differences across situations and across culture in levels of SDO between males and females is perhaps the most well documented of all the predictions made by social dominance theory. And the last big analysis of this hypothesis was done in a connection with a meta-analysis by Lee, Prado, and Johnson, published in Psych Bulletin in 2011. And basically what they did was look at 101 studies which have used the SDO scale, constituting 28,353 respondents across 16 nations. And the results showed that there was not a single case in which the level of SDO was higher among females than among males. It was always the case that the males had higher levels of SDO than females did. The second hypothesis, which comes out of this general orientation of ours, is what we call the subordinate male target hypothesis, or Smithy. And this basically argues that if we define ASD as the level of discrimination one suffers by virtue of being a member of a given arbitrary set category, that is, by being a Jew or African American or a Christian or whatever, the degree to which one suffers discrimination and oppression because of that will be greater among males on average than among females on average, which might or might not be greater than 0. All right. And if you think about this for a second, this notion of the subordinate male target hypothesis contradicts the kind of common sense, intuitive notion called double jeopardy, which basically argues that the degree to which one is oppressed by virtue of one's sex and by virtue of one's arbitrary set membership will lead to a double level of handicap, that the level of discrimination will be that much greater. And the subordinate male target hypothesis basically argues that this is not correct. And why this is not correct, we'll see in a minute. What's the nature of the evidence in support of these two predictions? Well, there's a great deal of evidence across survey evidence, which is the weakest form, the least compelling kind of evidence, but still indicative. Stronger evidence, which is archival evidence, which shows some reaction, some adherence to support of Smithy. And the firmest and most compelling kind of evidence we have is experimental evidence, in which we really have control over the experimental situation. And this evidence has been found across many different domains, including the labor market, the criminal justice system, the educational sector, retail markets, and in hate crime. So let's look at some of this evidence. We don't have time to go through all of it. We can just take some of it as for illustrative purposes. Hate crimes is one that we're going to look at. These are data from 2000 to 2003. This is Bureau of Justice Statistics data representing 210,000 acts of hate crimes across the United States. And what you find is that by far and away, males are more victims of hate crimes than are females by almost orders of magnitude. And the perpetrators of hate crimes are not only male, but the victims of it are also male. Most hate crimes are male on male activities. A second form of data, which looks at hate crimes and who its targets are, for gay homosexuals and gay people. It turns out that looking at 1,070 instances of hate crimes collected by the FBI, 86.2% of hate crimes are directed against gay males, whereas only 13.7% of hate crimes are directed towards gay females. Archival evidence in the labor market. What does that look like? Well, these are data of a median income in 2008 dollars, looking at the income of males and females, blacks and whites. And if we start looking at males first, we see that the median income in 2008 of white males was about $35,000 a year. Black males, $25,000 a year. A substantial difference in median income. Well, if we turn our attention to females, we see a very slight difference in the median income of males and females. But these data control for nothing, neither the kinds of jobs one has or anything else. These are simply the raw median income differences broken down by race and sex. If we start to look at, there's a study done by Farlin and Allen in 1987, looking at the increase in hourly wage as a function of increase in 1 year of formal education. That is to say, what's the return on investment for higher levels of education for men and women, blacks and whites. And these data were looked at in 1960 and 1980. So if we start in 1960 for males, we see that white males earned 78 cents more per hour for every additional year of education, whereas black males only earned 56 cents more per hour for every year of education. This was in 1960. If we follow that over 20 years, over basically a generation, we see that things have gotten better, that everybody seems to be making more money. But what's more to the point is that the difference in rate of return on educational investment is constant over time. That is to say, white males earn substantially more than black males do in terms of rate of return on educational investment. But what about females? In 1960, we see that there is no evidence of racial distinction between blacks, women, and white women in terms of return on educational investment. If anything, black females have a slightly higher rate of return on educational investment than black males do. How does it work in 1980? Well, it's the same phenomena there. There was no evidence of racial difference between black and white women for return on investment. It is the case that there's signs of sexism or patriarchy in the sense that females earn less money than males do. But if anything, black females earn more money than black males do. So it's 69 cents more per hour of every year of educational investment for Black males, and 79 cents more per hour for Black females. No evidence whatsoever of racial discrimination among females. We also followed up by looking at the 2010 census, and we got evidence of the subordinate male target hypothesis, in that the income difference between males, Blacks, and white was substantially greater than the income difference between white females and Black females. Chris Raj Chetty, who's an economist at Harvard University in a study of egalitarianism, did an analysis looking at child household income as a function of parental household income. And this basically looks at intergenerational transfers of wealth. And if we start with males over here to the left, we see that there is a pretty consistent difference in transfer rate for white families to their male offspring. And it's higher than the value transfer for Black males. But if we compare that with what's going on among females, we see that there is no difference in the degree to which parents can transfer wealth or economic standing or income to their daughters, if you're white, depending on whether the daughter is white or Black. If anything, the Black females enjoy a slightly higher transfer rate from their parents than do white females, but not significant. But what about the criminal justice system? These are data looking at the rate of incarceration per 100,000 by gender and race in 2010. The first thing one is struck by looking at this graph is that males are incarcerated at substantially higher levels than females are, which is interesting. But what we want to do is compare the difference in incarceration rate for males and females depending on the ethnicity you are. So if we look at women here, we can look at the Black-white ratio in terms of incarceration rate. And what we find is that among women, Black women are incarcerated at almost 3 times the rate as white women are, at 2.83 times as great. The difference in incarceration rate between Latino and white women is only 1.6 difference times greater than it is for whites. So that's what we would expect, but it's not dramatic. If we turn and look at the male difference, you find that Black males are incarcerated at 6.7 times the rate that white men are incarcerated. The same pattern is found for the incarceration rate of Latino males compared to white males. There's a difference of almost 3 times the rate. So there's evidence of the subordinate male target hypothesis with incarceration rates. But what about experimental evidence? Well, obviously it's going to be difficult to experiment with real data, sending people to jail or not. The closest kind of experimental paradigm that we can get, which is relevant to these kinds of questions we want to ask, is found in the shoot, no shoot, or the shoot, don't shoot experimental paradigm in which video films are shown to subjects for a couple of seconds, and each of the targets have some ambiguous item in their hand, but the picture is not shown large enough, long enough to give us an idea of a precise idea of what the object is. So the question is, what kinds of mistakes do people make when they're flashed with an object, a person, a black person, white person, male, female person, and they have to make a decision as to shoot the person or not. And the two kinds of mistakes errors one can make as a subject of this experiment. One of them is found by the white bars, and this represents the percentage of errors when you shoot an unarmed suspect. The dark bars represent the second kind of mistake you can make, which is not shooting an armed suspect. So the first thing we're going to look at is the number of mistakes made when the target person is a black male. We see that there is about a 23% of errors in this situation. Compare that with the mistakes that can be made for white males. We see that black males are likely to be shot if they're unarmed at substantially higher rates than white males are. But more importantly, there is a vast difference between the mistakes made for shooting unarmed black males compared to unarmed black females. There is no greater chance of being shot if you're a black female compared to if you're a white male. And similarly, the error rate for shooting is the same for white females as it is for black females. In other words, among females, there was no evidence of racial discrimination, with one possible exception, and that is that armed white females are least likely to get shot. You're likely to make a mistake in not shooting them when you shoot. What about the labor market? Experimental evidence. Well, the best kinds of experimental evidence we have on the labor market, discrimination within the labor market, is found in correspondence or audit studies. And an audit study is a study in which you send out job applicants who have the same credentials, the same work experience, where they go to the same schools, and you see who gets the job offer and who doesn't, or the only difference between the job applicants is the function of which arbitrary set condition group they belong to. And there were, at the time of writing this paper up, 19 audit studies had been conducted across 5 different countries, including Britain, Netherlands, Germany, the USA, and Canada. And the types of audit studies or correspondence studies are letters written to prospective employers, telephone audits where you call up on the telephone to seek a job, and in-person audits where you basically show up to apply for a job. And the dominant subordinate contrasts in these 19 studies were whites versus West Indians, white versus East Indians, native whites versus Greek immigrants, white versus blacks, white versus Latinos, German versus Turks, Dutch versus Surinamese, and Dutch versus Moroccans. In other words, it was a large set of different kinds of contrasts looked at to make sure that these results weren't specific to a specific ethnic group or pair of ethnic groups. And the data showed that there was greater than zero levels of discrimination across all three methodologies of these audit studies. But this controls for nothing, and it doesn't get to our basic question, which was, is there a gender by arbitrary set interaction in levels of discrimination? And these bars show that males have a slightly higher discrimination rate than females do, but that's not significant. And then what we did was control for differences in the kinds of jobs which were being sought after in terms of level of education demanded, levels of contact with the public, etc. And doing this, controlling for this, we find substantially higher levels of discrimination for among males than among females. A more up-to-date study, correspondence study, was done in Sweden, in which these experimenters looked at the discrimination rate for job seekers with Arab names compared to Swedish-speaking people with Swedish-sounding names. And what they did was, if they reasoned that if there was no discrimination between against Arab-sounding names, then the callback ratio should be 1. An equally large number of whites or native Swedes should be called back for interviews as those with Arab-sounding names. And first, looking at these data, we see no difference in the callback ratio between men and women. It is the case here that these numbers represent the fact that native Swedes were twice as likely to get called back for a job interview than native Swedes were, than Arabs were, but there was no gender by ethnicity interaction. But then these researchers did a very interesting change to the experimental paradigm. They asked themselves the question, what would it take for an Arab job applicant in Sweden to have the same chance of being hired as a native Swede? In other words, what would you do to try to produce this non-discriminatory situation? And what they did was enhance the CV of the job applicant by giving the Arab-sounding name 2 years more of job-related, job-relevant experience compared to the Swede. And when that happened, when they did that, the following happened. There was no longer among females a significant difference between callback rates for white Swedish females compared to Arab females. But among males, it was among highly qualified Arab males who are even more likely to be discriminated against than equivalent white males. A huge difference in the callback ratio. What about prepared fear? A set of experiments has looked at, has argued that there are two kinds of animals in the world, unprepared and prepared. And by unprepared, we mean that humans are predisposed to be fearful of the group of animals. So like butterflies and ducks, humans are unprepared to be afraid of. Over our evolutionary history, there's no reason to be predated against by these two animals. In contrast, there are also animals whom we're prepared to be afraid of, like venomous snakes and poisonous spiders. And the authors of this experiment did something interesting. They reinforced pictures of prepared and unprepared stimuli by giving electric shock and exposing the subject to white noise every time one of these unprepared pictures came on a computer screen. So if you sat there in front of your computer screen, every time the duck appeared, let's say, you were given a shock and exposed to unpleasant white noise. So you were able to condition the unprepared stimuli in one condition, in one situation over here, and not do it over here, which just show a picture of a butterfly. Doing this several times will produce a conditioned response. That is to say, without being exposed to white noise or electric shock, every time the duck's picture is shown, you should have a galvanic skin response, an automatic response of fear in this conditioned stimuli. And the reasoning went that it should be the case that once you cease shocking one of these pictures, there will be a dissipation of a automatic response of fear after showing the duck versus the butterfly, that fear response will extinguish. But that will not be the case for animals that we're prepared to fear. So even after you stop shocking somebody when you see a picture of a venomous snake, the conditioned fear never quite goes away. And the reasoning is because we are really evolved to be afraid, inherently afraid of certain kinds of animals. Well, Olson, Ebert, and Benagi and Phelps decided to see whether or not this prepared fear paradigm would work with human subjects as targets, as well as pictures of poisonous snakes and butterflies. And they reasoned that for white subjects in the United States, pictures of other white males are unprepared and we're not prepared to be afraid of them, everything else being equal. But we are prepared, or they are prepared, to be afraid of African Americans, everything else being equal. So in the unprepared condition, one of these unprepared targets was paired with an electric shock and unpleasant white noise. And then it was observed how long it took that prepared response to dissipate once you stop shocking them and blasting them with white noise. And this was done for both unprepared subjects which we assume you're not built or predisposed to fear, versus those who you are prepared to fear. And what they discovered was that in the acquisition of the fear response was higher for the black face than for the white face here. These are for white subjects. And the extinction level went away completely for the white face, but it never quite went away for the black face here. So once people were trained or conditioned to fear African Americans, the fear of African Americans, the heightened level of fear, never quite dissipated. Now, what these researchers didn't do was see if this pattern was modified by gender, because social dominance theory would argue that you'll get a prepared fear difference in this paradigm, especially when you vary the target's gender. So this is what we did in a political science, a psychological science paper, in which the dependent variable was the skin conductance response. The independent variables were exposure to conditioned stimuli of males and females, in-group and out-group faces. And what we found was the following. For female targets, regardless of whether they were in-group or out-group targets, whether they were white females or black females, when the response, the stimuli was no longer coupled with electric shocks and white noise, the conditioned response dissipated, it extinguished, it went away in the female target condition. The fear extinction response also went away when it was an in-group male target. But what was especially interesting to us is that fear of the out-group male target, this bar here, the conditioned resistance to fear never quite went away. That is to say, once you're conditioned to be fearful of out-group males, that fear never quite dissipates. It remains quite constant for a much longer period of time. We did a second experiment looking at whether the subordinate male target hypothesis varies by the gender and race of the target and the gender and race of the perpetrator or the respondent. And we did what we call a Vladimir's test experiment, a Vladimir's choice experiment. And Vladimir's was a Russian peasant who had 15 kids and very little food and almost no money. And he was starving, he and his family. And one day God came down to Vladimir and said, Vladimir, I'm God. I will grant you one wish. Anything you want, you get. Just name it. It's yours. There's only one hitch. Anything I give you, I'll give your neighbor down the road, Nikolai, twice as much as you get. Twice as much as I get? Yep. Twice as much as you get, we will give to Nikolai. And Vladimir thought about this said, I'll come back to you about this, God. And he thought about it and came back to God eventually and said to God, this is what I want. I want you to take out one of my eyes. Okay? This is what we call a spiteful allocation. When people are willing to pay a very high price for the privilege and pleasure of debilitating an enemy substantially more than they are damaged by it. And in this experiment, we look at the gender of the respondent, the gender of the target, and the ethnic category of the gender of the female and male target. And the experimental setup went like this. It was an allocation task given to participants, assuming that the University of California decided to assess the yearly fees, student fees of student organizations, various ethnically oriented student organizations. And the subject had to choose which combination of punishment, I could say, that you were going to suffer. So there are three, in principle, choices one can make. One can even make the choice that you're going to be fined by the unit of $13,000, $13,000 for the in-group and $13,000 for the out-group. So everybody gets an equal amount of pain. Or you can choose a combination of $7,000 for the in-group and $1,000 for the out-group. This is the more economically rational choice. That is to say, you only have to pay $7,000 in fees, extra fees. The problem with this choice for some people is that you have to pay a lot more money in fees for outgroup, for the outgroup than for the in-group. Or one can make a Vladimir's choice. This is the more extreme version of the Vladimir's choice. When you're willing to pay $19,000 in extra assessments for your in-group and $25,000 for the out-group to be assessed. So you're willing to increase the pain of the out-group at a high cost to your in-group. And we expected that the likelihood of making a Vladimir's choice will depend upon the gender and ethnicity or arbitrary-set membership of the target and the perpetrator. And looking at the results of this experiment, we got the following things. This 0 here represents no discrimination at all. That means everybody gets the same amount. Positive numbers here represent degrees of Vladimir's choice, and negative numbers represent economically rational decisions where everybody pays less money, even though your outgroup pays less money, even less money than you do. And what we find is that in the case of female targets, everybody seems to make economically rational choices. That is to say, it's either at 0, the Vladimir's choice, or slightly negative. So this is a rational choice, economically rational choice. If you're a male target and a female respondent, which is this bar right here, you're also likely to make a economically rational choice. You're not making a spiteful allocation. The only situation in which spiteful allocations of Vladimir's choice are to be found was in the case of male respondents and male perpetrators. This bar right here. So the conclusions. We argue that arbitrary-set prejudice and discrimination are gendered phenomena. This means that compared to females, males are more likely to exhibit xenophobic, socially predatory, and anti-egalitarian behaviors, everything else being equal. And consistent with the subordinate male target hypotheses, males are not only more likely to be instigators of dominance-tinged social predation, but the targets of such social predation as well. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, if everyone can unmute again, we can give a round of applause. Thanks, Jim. That was great. We have time for questions. So we can either use the chat if you'd like, or go ahead and speak up. And if possible, turn on your camera. If not, that's fine. But we do have time for questions. Well, if no one else will, I can start. Jim, I had a couple of questions. You opened the talk by talking about how the attempts at civil rights you deemed a failure. And I want to sort of pick up on that and some of the things that you talked about today. So is your view that there are no social processes that might kind of alter the magnitude of these differences or not? And I'll give you two examples of research that may or may not be related. One, the work by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson on homicide rates being influenced by inequality. And what they found was that the rate of homicide from male to female, basically male homicide rates vary across groups, but any other type of homicide, male, female, male, female, those are constant. And the best predictor of the rate at which males kill other males within groups is the degree of inequality. And the argument being reduce social inequality and you can reduce this male homicide rate. So that's a within group kind of discussion they're having. So that's one example, potentially also arguments by people like Steve Pinker that violence has decreased over the last few thousand years. So how do you see this kind of evolved psychology of outgroup male target hypothesis in relation to kind of social factors and secular changes? Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, you know exactly what you're saying. I'd argue that these two positions are not at all in contradiction with one another. That there are conditions under which the subordinate male target hypothesis will be more severe or less severe. Okay, so that's, and there's no reason to think that you can't affect the level of discrimination by increasing the economic, let's say, equality within the society. What I simply argue is that you're only changing the difference in degree of discrimination rather than the difference in kind, that there will always be this predisposition for dominant males to exert socially predatory behavior, which can be moderated somewhat to be more or less severe, but it will always be there as a constant.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. We have a question from Andre, who's in the philosophy department.
Hello, I'm not sure I'm going to give a very coherent question, but I had some thoughts that prompted by when you were talking about your invariance hypothesis and looking at some evidence for this. I was thinking, and this may be a slight follow-up to Karthik. So I was thinking about context and priming. So if we can I wonder how people would respond when you give them sort of certain context. So I was thinking about cases in which you were saying that people would be more inclined to, want to step on other groups to get ahead, these sorts of things. But if you put people in certain contexts, so for example, if you put them in a context where they're competing for limited resources, you might be more likely to get those kinds of respondents. I'm thinking about just off the top of my head, robber cave experiments by Sharif,
Right.
things like that. And so I wonder if you can control for that, right? That you would get this kind of very bad behavior or these kinds of behaviors if you prompt them. And then what happens if you don't prompt them? Would you get changes in any of your data and your...
Well, I mean, one of the things which is really quite interesting is that in the Robbers Cave experiment, remember it was done over 3 weeks, I believe. And the first week, these boys were not made aware of that there was another group of boys nearby. When they became aware of them, they were not put in a zero-sum situation with them. They were put in that kind of competitive zero-sum situation the third and last week of the experiment. And what was remarkable about that experiment is that it did not take much. It did not take it did not take a zero-sum situational structure to drive discrimination. As soon as they were aware of the fact that there was another group of boys, they began to make in-group, out-group comparisons that we're better than they are. They must be a bunch of sissies, and we're not, right? And this is also consistent with social identity theory, which basically discovered that not only did you not have to make zero-sum distinctions were not necessary in order to produce discriminatory behavior, but even the actual existence of these groups was not necessary to drive this kinds of behavior. That is to say, if you came up with totally fictitious groups, gazibbles and gazabbles, and you allowed the individual, the test subject, to identify with the gazibbles or gazabbles and ask them who was better, who was smarter, who was more noble, to whom should I give more money to? There's a tendency to give more money to the in-group, regardless of whether or not there is such an in-group, that it exists at all. So the bottom line here is that human beings seem to be predisposed to form in-group, out-group distinctions and allocate social value on that basis. I mean, the degree to which that happens is moderated across cultures. And that's sort of what Steve Pinker was talking about. But I fundamentally disagree with Steve in the sense that it takes very little. You need to disturb the balance or the equilibrium and power relations between two groups, arbitrary groups, to get extreme levels of violence over very little cause. And the war in Bosnia was an example of that, or the war against in Uganda against the Tutsis and the Hutu was the same phenomena. It was very little that was necessary to prompt that kind of ferociousness. in humans.
So these are kind of triggered behaviors on your account. So they're riding the surface. They're sort of, in some sense, innate, and then they're triggered. They're not learned from the particular context. It's just
Exactly. I mean, the situations do moderate the severity of that behavior. And that's sort of what Steve is talking about, that we've become more civilized over time, not as brutal over time. But my argument against that is that those hindrances of brutality are very fragile. And it doesn't take very much at all to break it down and to expose us to these tendencies to dominate the other.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, one quick follow-up just to ask you about your presentation. You were referring to work that you've done, but this is a very comprehensive presentation. You have a book that covers all this?
Yes, I do. It's called Social Dominance Theory, Social Dominance, a Theory of Social Oppression and Discrimination. It's authored by me and a woman called Felicia Prado. And there's a softcover version of this, which is published in 2001.
I can lend you my copy, Andre.
All right, thank you.